I still remember the day I received the invitation. It came in the mail, tucked inside an envelope embossed with gold lettering. My best friend, Daniel, was getting married. We'd been inseparable since childhood, and seeing him tie the knot with the love of his life was something I wouldn't have missed for the world. The wedding was set to take place at an exclusive vineyard estate just outside the city, a venue known for its grandeur and luxury. Daniel and I had always joked about his penchant for the finer things, and this was no exception. The invitation mentioned a black tie dress code, and though it wasn't my usual style, I decided to embrace the occasion fully. The thing about Daniel was that he'd always been a social chameleon. He could fit into any crowd, charm anyone with his easy confidence, and make them feel like they belonged. It was one of the things I admired most about him. But as we grew older, I began to notice subtle changes in the circles he moved in, wealthy, powerful people who exuded an air of exclusivity. Still, I thought our bond was unshakable. It didn't matter that my life was quieter, more grounded. I ran a small business, unassuming from the outside but thriving beyond what most people could imagine. I kept a low profile, preferring to let the work speak for itself. Daniel had always known this about me, and I never felt the need to flaunt what I had. The week leading up to the wedding was a flurry of preparation. I picked out a sharp tuxedo, bought a thoughtful gift for the couple, and even rehearsed a few jokes for my toast. It felt good to be part of something so joyous. But nothing could have prepared me for what would unfold that day, or the revelation that would change everything. The day of the wedding dawned crisp and clear, the kind of perfect weather you'd hope for on such an occasion. The estate was breathtaking, even more grand than I'd imagined. Rows of vines stretched across the rolling hills, kissed by the morning sun. The main building, an elegant mix of old-world charm and modern luxury, stood like a crown jewel overlooking the landscape. I arrived early, wanting to soak it all in before the crowds descended. The valet greeted me with a polite smile and took my car. I handed over the elegantly wrapped gift box, which was promptly whisked away to the gift table by an attendant. Inside, the estate's grand hall was buzzing with activity. Chandeliers sparkled overhead, and servers in crisp uniforms moved like clockwork, setting tables adorned with crystal glasses and floral centerpieces. It was as if the entire place had been plucked straight out of a fairy tale. I spotted Daniel across the room, deep in conversation with a group of people I didn't recognize. He looked sharp in his tailored tuxedo, his smile bright and effortless. When his gaze landed on me, I expected the familiar warmth of his grin. But instead, his expression shifted, briefly, almost imperceptibly, to something else. Was it discomfort? I brushed it off, telling myself I was imagining things. As I approached, Daniel raised a hand in greeting. "Hey! You made it," he said, pulling me into a quick, almost perfunctory hug. "Of course," I said, clapping him on the back. "Wouldn't miss it for the world." He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Listen, I've got to finish up here, but make yourself at home. Food and drinks are on the terrace. We'll catch up later." Before I could respond, he turned back to his conversation, leaving me standing there, feeling slightly out of place. It was strange, but I shrugged it off. After all, weddings were chaotic, and Daniel probably had a million things on his mind. I made my way to the terrace, where guests mingled, sipping champagne and enjoying the view. I exchanged pleasantries with a few people, but most of them didn't seem particularly interested in small talk. I noticed subtle glances, assessments, almost, and the way conversation shifted when I joined. It was clear that these weren't my people. They spoke in casual tones about exotic vacations, private jets, and high-stakes business deals, their laughter ringing out like a currency of its own. I felt like a visitor in a world where I didn't quite belong, but it didn't bother me. My business success was a private affair, and I had no desire to parade it. Still, a small part of me began to wonder why Daniel hadn't mentioned these changes in his life, the wealth, the exclusivity. We used to share everything, and yet this part of his world felt entirely unfamiliar. As I stood by the balustrade, nursing a glass of champagne and admiring the view, I resolved to shake off the oddness of the morning. This was Daniel's day, and I was here to celebrate him. Whatever distance had grown between us, I hoped we could bridge it. But the sense of unease lingered, a quiet whisper that something wasn't quite right. The ceremony itself was stunning. Rows of white chairs were set on a manicured lawn overlooking the vineyard, and a string quartet played softly in the background. The bride, Lila, looked radiant as she walked down the aisle. Her dress shimmered in the sunlight, and her smile could have lit up the entire valley. Daniel, standing at the altar, looked every bit the proud groom. I sat near the back, watching the proceedings unfold with a bittersweet sense of pride. My best friend had made it, found the woman of his dreams, and now, here he was, surrounded by love and joy. I wanted to share in that happiness, even if I still felt like a guest on the outside looking in. After the vows and the exchange of rings, the crowd erupted in applause as the couple kissed and made their way back down the aisle. I joined in, clapping and smiling as they passed, their joy infectious. For a brief moment, I felt my doubts fade. The reception followed immediately after, a whirlwind of music, laughter, and celebration. I made my way to my assigned table and found myself seated with a mix of unfamiliar faces. They were polite but distant, and I quickly realized that most of the guests here were old money families or business magnates. Their casual name-dropping of high-profile people and luxury brands made me chuckle inwardly. Little did they know I'd surpassed many of their accomplishments in my own quiet way. But the real moment came during the toasts. I had prepared something simple but heartfelt, reminiscing about my and Daniel's adventures growing up, and how proud I was of the man he had become. As I rose to speak, I noticed Daniel exchanging a glance with Lila. Her expression was unreadable, but his looked uneasy. Was he embarrassed? I pushed through the toast, keeping it light and short, but by the time I sat down, the feeling of being out of place had returned, stronger than ever. No one at my table even acknowledged the speech beyond a polite clap. Still, I told myself it didn't matter. The night was about Daniel and Lila, not me. But then came the incident, the moment that would change everything. It started innocently enough. I had stepped away to grab another drink when I heard Daniel's voice calling me from across the room. "Hey, can we talk for a second?" he asked, walking toward me with quick, purposeful strides. "Sure," I said, setting my glass down. "Everything okay?" His gaze darted around the room before landing on me. "Look, this is awkward, but," he hesitated, lowering his voice. "Some of the guests have, mentioned that they're uncomfortable." I frowned, confused. Uncomfortable? With what? Daniel's expression tightened. "It's just, this is a high-profile event, and, appearances matter." My confusion turned to disbelief. "What are you trying to say, Daniel?" He ran a hand through his hair, avoiding my eyes. "I think it's best if you leave. I mean, it's nothing personal, but it's just not a good look, For a moment, I couldn't process his words. I stared at him, waiting for some sign that this was a bad joke. But his expression told me he was serious. "Not a good look?" I repeated, my voice low. "Are you saying I don't belong here?" No, he said quickly, though his tone was anything but convincing. "It's just, some people don't understand your situation. They don't know your background." It hit me then, he thought I was beneath them. He thought I wasn't worthy of being part of his new world. The man who had once been my closest friend now saw me as an embarrassment. "Daniel," I said, my voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface, "I came here to celebrate you. To stand by your side on one of the most important days of your life. And now you're asking me to leave because, what? I don't fit in?" He shifted uncomfortably, his face reddening. "It's not like that. I need to think about appearances. I'm sorry." I stood there, staring at him, feeling a mix of hurt, anger, and disbelief. But instead of causing a scene, I simply nodded. "All right, Daniel. If that's how you feel, I'll leave." And with that, I turned and walked out, leaving behind the glittering chandeliers, the music, and the man I thought I knew. But little did Daniel know, he just made the biggest mistake of his life. I walked out of the grand hall, my footsteps echoing down the marble corridor, each step heavier than the last. Outside, the night air was cool and sharp, but it did little to clear the storm brewing in my chest. I looked back at the estate, the soft glow of the lights spilling out of the windows, and for a moment, I thought about turning around. About confronting Daniel, about asking him if he truly believed I wasn't good enough. But then, a different thought crossed my mind. If he couldn't see my worth, if he'd forgotten everything we'd been through together, then why should I? The valet approached, holding my car keys, but I waved him off. "I'll walk for a bit," I said. He hesitated but nodded, stepping back into the shadows. I needed space to breathe, to think. The winding path through the vineyard stretched ahead, lit faintly by lanterns, and I let my feet carry me forward. As I walked, my mind wandered back to where it all began. Daniel and I had grown up in the same small town, where opportunities were scarce, and hard work was the only currency that mattered. We spent our summers working odd jobs, mowing lawns, fixing fences, and, one memorable summer, helping out at a local welding shop. That summer had changed everything for me. I still remembered the crackle of the welding torch, the intense heat, the satisfaction of fusing two pieces of metal into one unbreakable bond. The shop owner, an older man named Pete, had taken me under his wing, teaching me the craft and, unknowingly, planting the seed of what would become my future. I'd spent years honing those skills, eventually building a small welding and fabrication business out of my garage. It started small, repairing farm equipment, crafting custom gates, but word spread, and soon, I was taking on larger projects. By the time I hit my stride, I was designing high-end metalwork for luxury homes, art installations, and even commercial spaces. My business grew quietly but steadily, and though I never flaunted my success, I took pride in the empire I had built from nothing. Daniel knew all of this, or at least, he used to. But somewhere along the way, it seemed he'd forgotten. Or maybe he just didn't care. As I reached the edge of the vineyard, I stopped and leaned against a wooden post, staring out at the endless rows of vines. The moonlight cast a soft glow over the landscape, and for a moment, I felt the anger in me settle, replaced by something quieter. Sadness, perhaps. Disappointment. I pulled out my phone, scrolling absent-mindedly through my messages, until I landed on a folder of photos, pictures of my work. Elegant, intricate railings. Sculptural installations that had been featured in design magazines. A custom chandelier I'd welded for a renowned architect's home. Each image was a reminder of the life I'd built, a life that Daniel had dismissed without a second thought. I tucked the phone back into my pocket and straightened up. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. To stop letting people assume they knew my worth because I didn't bother to show it. If Daniel didn't know who I was, then I'd make sure he, and everyone else, found out soon enough. I turned back toward the estate, a quiet resolve settling over me. I wasn't going back to crash the wedding or to prove a point to Daniel, not yet, anyway. But I wasn't leaving quietly, either. I had plans, and they were just starting to take shape. By the time I returned to the valet stand, my plan was forming. The valet handed me my keys with a smile, and as I slid into my car, I felt a flicker of excitement, like the sparks from a welding torch when metal first starts to fuse. I wasn't just leaving the wedding, I was setting something in motion, something that would make Daniel rethink every choice he'd made tonight. The drive back home was quiet, the road illuminated by the soft glow of my headlights. My workshop wasn't far, a large, unassuming space tucked away on the outskirts of town. From the outside, it looked like any other industrial building, but inside was where the real magic happened. Rows of tools and machinery filled the space, alongside shelves stacked with raw materials, steel rods, sheets of aluminum, and ornate wrought iron ready to be shaped into something beautiful. I parked outside, walked in, and flipped on the lights. The hum of fluorescent bulbs filled the air as shadows gave way to the familiar sight of my workbench. This shop had been my sanctuary, the place where I poured my energy and creativity into every piece I made. It had seen me through tough times and triumphs alike, and now, standing there in the quiet stillness, I felt its steady presence bolster me. I ran a hand over the cool surface of the welding table, its edges worn smooth by years of use. Nearby, one of my latest projects sat waiting, a sleek, custom-designed gate commissioned by a high-profile client. I had been refining the details all week, ensuring every weld was flawless, every curve precise. This was the kind of work that made my business elite, though I rarely talked about it. As I prepared my tools, I thought about Daniel. About how he and I had always supported each other in the past. About how his dismissal tonight had felt like a slap in the face. But I also thought about the people he had surrounded himself with, the ones who whispered behind my back, assuming they knew who I was. they had no idea. But soon, they would. I pulled on my gloves and lowered my welding helmet. The torch ignited with a hiss, and the shop came alive with the brilliant light of molten metal. The heat, the sparks, the sheer intensity of it was exhilarating, like creating fire itself. The sound of the torch cutting through steel was rhythmic, almost meditative, as I worked. My hands moved with practiced precision, and I lost myself in the process. Welding always gave me clarity. It was where I felt most at peace, most capable of turning raw materials into something extraordinary. And as I worked, I began to think about how I could use what I had built, my skills, my resources, my network, to reshape the narrative Daniel had created about me. By the time I was done for the night, my plan was nearly complete. I powered down the equipment, pulled off my helmet, and stood back to admire the piece I'd just finished, a small addition to my larger project, but one that carried a personal message. It wasn't just a product of craftsmanship, it was a symbol of who I was, of what I stood for. I didn't need Daniel's approval, nor did I crave the validation of his new world. But I wouldn't let him or anyone else undermine my worth. Not anymore. As I locked up the shop and stepped into the crisp night air, I felt a sense of determination I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about proving something to Daniel. It was about reclaiming my own story. The real reveal was still to come, and when it happened, it would be unforgettable. The following morning, I woke with a clear purpose. The faint aches from the previous night's welding were a familiar comfort, a reminder that hard work always left its mark. I sipped my coffee at the kitchen table, staring at a list of names and addresses I'd jotted down in a small notebook. These weren't just any names, they were the people I'd worked with over the years. Clients, collaborators, and architects who had commissioned my work for luxury homes, high-end businesses, and art galleries. I made a few calls, keeping the conversations light and casual. "Hey, it's been a while," I started with each one. Most were pleasantly surprised to hear from me. I wasn't fishing for compliments or even new projects, I was laying the groundwork for something bigger. Each call ended the same way, with me thanking them for their trust in my work. Later that day, I headed back to my workshop to finalize a few pending projects. The place was alive with the hum of activity, the soft buzz of a grinder smoothing out edges, the rhythmic tapping of a hammer shaping metal, and the occasional burst of sparks from my torch. It was in this chaos that I thrived. One project in particular caught my attention, a centerpiece I'd been crafting for a high-profile charity gala happening the following month. It was a sculptural work, a fusion of form and function, elegant curves that mimicked the flow of water, welded seamlessly into a polished steel fountain. The piece was already being buzzed about in design circles, and I knew its unveiling would make waves. I paused, wiping sweat from my brow, and smiled to myself. This would be one of many reminders of who I was and what I had built, without needing to explain a single thing. But I wasn't done yet. I made one more phone call that afternoon, this time to a mutual acquaintance of mine and Daniel's. His name was Marcus, an entrepreneur who had commissioned a custom-designed metal staircase for his penthouse the previous year. Marcus moved in the same high-profile circles as Daniel, but he'd always treated me with respect, recognizing my craft for what it was. "Marcus, it's good to hear from you," I said when he picked up. "Likewise," he replied. "What's on your mind?" "I've got a piece going up at the Charity Fund Gala next month," I said, keeping my tone casual. "Thought you might want a sneak peek before the crowd gets to it." "You know me, I can't resist a good preview," Marcus said with a chuckle. "When and where?" We made plans for him to stop by the shop in a few days. Marcus's approval wasn't just valuable, it was strategic. If anyone could amplify my work to the kind of people Daniel now considered his crowd, it was him. As I hung up the phone, I felt the momentum building. I wasn't planning to confront Daniel directly, not yet. Instead, I was creating ripples, setting the stage for a moment where he and everyone else in his orbit would realize just how wrong they'd been to underestimate me. The best part? I wouldn't have to lift a finger to force that moment. My work would speak for itself. That night, as I stood in the workshop with the lights dimmed, I ran my fingers over the smooth, welded edges of the fountain centerpiece. Each detail, each line and curve, held a part of me. I thought back to that moment at the wedding when Daniel had told me to leave. He dismissed me as if I were invisible, a footnote in his new, polished world. But soon, he'd see. They all would. The sparks from the welding torch might have faded, but the fire within me burned brighter than ever. The week leading up to Marcus's visit was a whirlwind of preparation. I poured every ounce of energy into finishing the fountain centerpiece, ensuring that every detail was flawless. It wasn't just a project anymore, it was a statement. When Marcus arrived at the shop, he stepped out of his sleek black car with the casual confidence of a man used to luxury. He wasn't alone, though. To my surprise, he'd brought a few colleagues with him: an interior designer, an art collector, and a magazine editor who specialized in high-end lifestyle features. "Hope you don't mind," Marcus said with a grin. "I figured they'd appreciate what you've been working on as much as I do." I didn't mind at all. In fact, it was better than I could have hoped. I led them into the workshop, and the group immediately took in the space, the organized chaos of tools and materials, the faint scent of metal and oil in the air. But it wasn't long before their attention shifted to the fountain centerpiece, standing under a spotlight in the center of the room. Marcus approached first, his sharp eyes scanning the piece. The polished steel seemed to shimmer under the light, its fluid, cascading design capturing the illusion of movement even in stillness. The others followed, their quiet murmurs growing into audible admiration. "This is extraordinary," the designer said, circling the piece. "The craftsmanship is impeccable." The magazine editor, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, nodded. "It's not just art, it's storytelling. This is the kind of work people pay attention to." I thanked them humbly, explaining the inspiration behind the design, a reflection of resilience, of how strength and beauty can emerge even under intense pressure. The art collector took particular interest, snapping a few photos and asking about commissioning a similar piece for an upcoming exhibition. Marcus turned to me with a knowing smile. "You've outdone yourself, as usual. I think this piece is going to make waves at the gala." The editor chimed in. "Waves? This is a tsunami. I'll make sure it's featured prominently in our next issue." As the group chatted among themselves, I felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. They saw me for what I truly was, not a guest to be dismissed, but an artist, a craftsman whose work spoke louder than words. Before leaving, Marcus clapped me on the shoulder. "You know, Daniel's been talking about having some custom work done for his new place," he said. "After seeing this, I might need to mention that he's missing out by not calling you." The irony wasn't lost on me. "Well, Marcus," I said with a small smile, "maybe he'll figure that out soon enough." The rumblings begin. It didn't take long for word to spread. A few days after Marcus's visit, the magazine editor followed through on her promise, sending a photographer to capture the fountain for a feature spread. The piece was slated to appear in an issue that catered to the exact crowd Daniel had surrounded himself with: wealthy, influential people who prided themselves on being tastemakers. What I didn't expect, though, was how quickly the buzz would reach Daniel himself. A week later, my phone lit up with an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hey, it's Daniel," the voice said, sounding hesitant. "I saw something about a project you're working on. Looks like you've been busy." The pause that followed was deafening. This was a man who had dismissed me just days ago, now realizing I wasn't the embarrassment he thought I was. "Oh, I've been keeping busy," I replied, keeping my tone polite but firm. "Good to hear from you, Daniel." He laughed nervously, trying to bridge the gap between us. "Yeah, listen, I've been meaning to reach out. Maybe we should catch up soon?" I didn't commit to anything, letting the silence stretch before changing the subject. "Anyway, hope the wedding turned out as perfectly as you hoped." "Oh, it did," he said quickly, but I could hear the tension in his voice. "Let's talk soon, all right?" I hung up, staring at the phone for a moment before setting it down. The pieces were falling into place, and Daniel was starting to realize just how wrong he'd been. But this wasn't the end, not yet. The best was still to come. The night of the charity gala arrived. The venue was packed with the elite business magnates, designers, and media personalities. My fountain centerpiece stood proudly in the main hall, illuminated by dramatic lighting that made its curves shimmer like liquid silver. As I mingled quietly, I noticed Daniel and Lila entering. They were all smiles, basking in the attention of their high society peers. But their expressions shifted when they saw the fountain, surrounded by an admiring crowd. Marcus approached them, gesturing toward the piece. Beautiful, isn't it? You won't believe who made it. Daniel frowned slightly. Who? Your old friend, Marcus said, grinning. He's a rising star in the design world. Daniel's face fell as realization dawned. He looked around, his gaze finally landing on me. For a brief moment, our eyes met. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. I nodded politely, then turned back to the crowd surrounding my work. My silence said it all. I stayed at the gala just long enough to see the ripple effect. Guests were buzzing about the fountain, photographers snapping pictures for the press. Daniel lingered near the edges of the crowd, watching as I moved effortlessly among the attendees, shaking hands with designers and collectors. As the night wound down, I prepared to leave. Daniel finally worked up the courage to approach me. I had no idea, he began, his voice low, almost apologetic. I held up a hand, stopping him. It's fine, Daniel, I said calmly. You made your choice back at the wedding. Tonight, I'm just here as an artist sharing my work. His shoulders sagged slightly, and I could see the regret in his eyes. I misjudged you, he admitted. I gave him a small, measured smile. You did. But it's not my job to prove myself to anyone. With that, I walked away, leaving Daniel standing there, the weight of his mistake settling heavily on his shoulders. Outside, I took one last deep breath of the crisp night air, knowing I'd reclaimed my worth not through confrontation, but by letting my work speak louder than words.